Boy, was I wrong. And you know what? I couldn't be happier. I actually really love it when this happens. So what are the pillars that are talked about in the Bible? This is actually something that I wrote about in The Day the Earth Stands Still. And I can happily say I was wrong about something that I wrote. So we're gonna talk about that. Also, speaking of The Day the Earth Stands Still, now a Texas governor, I believe, or a politician, he has went on Twitter to say that extraterrestrials need to accept Jesus Christ as their savior. And usually we would look at that and say, well, that's we know what that's all about. That's terrible theology. That's but I actually think this guy is being dragged through the mud through this publication, and we're going to get into all of that and more on today's Peck Report. All right, everybody. Hope you are doing well. For those of you who follow me and things that I'm involved in, I do have a new movie coming out called Silent Cry: The Darker Side of Trafficking. And actually, let me see if I should have did this. I should have prepared a little better before recording. Let me see if I have a copy of it. I do not, but you can. You can look it up at skywatchtv.com, and I'll have links to it at dailyrenegade.com as well. But it's about the horrible scourge of sex trafficking, child sex trafficking in our culture. And it's really about separating the sensationalism from fact and focusing on the facts of it. But here's the thing, within those facts, there are things that sound like they would be sensational, but surprisingly they're not. So is the occult involved in child sex trafficking? To a certain point, yes. Now, again, a lot of that stuff becomes sensationalized. The same thing happened in the Satanic Panic decades ago, but it made it easy, just like in the Satanic Panic, we're living in a day like that today, where back then it made it easy for people to just cast the whole thing off as conspiracy theory, but that wasn't true. There were actual children being hurt. Now, not every claim was true. There's a lot of sensationalism. There was a lot of false information out there. Well, history is repeating itself because we're living in a time that's exactly like that, except now it's more widespread because we have the internet, whereas back then that wasn't available. So now it's easier to spread misinformation and sensationalism, but the good thing is it's easier to spread real information too. So that's what this movie is all about. It doesn't hold back. It does get into some very dark areas. But it's dark areas of truth. And in the movie, the people I interview, whenever we put information out, it's backed up by something. So some of these experts, they work with kids and they've seen this stuff firsthand. So at the time of this recording, just yesterday, we recorded the episodes for Skywatch TV, 4 episodes for the movie, and make sure to watch those, because in the episodes we actually don't do much talking, and we spend a lot of the time showing clips from the movie, so you'll actually get to see some of the movie. Now, I want to really emphasize it's definitely not the whole movie. There's a lot that's in the movie we could not air on network TV, but also just for sake of time. The whole movie is over 2 hours long, and so for each episode we did maybe on average 15, 20 minutes of the movie. So we showed large clips, but it isn't even half of what's available in the movie. So keep watching Skywatch TV for that. And I'll be talking more about that as well as time progresses, but I don't want to get hung up just on that, because we got things to talk about, and I know you came here to see what I was wrong about, and it's not a clickbait title. It's actually totally real. So I'll tell you a quick story, and I'm human and I'm prone to this too, and I think it's good when we realize that. When I first started getting involved in ministry, as an author specifically, I kind of had this at first. I kind of had this fear, or like this anxiety about, well, what happens if I write something and it turns out I was wrong? Like, let's say years later, it turns out that I was wrong about something I wrote. How would I handle that? And like, the only right answer is you handle it in truth. You just be truthful about it. But I think sometimes, and I'm not even thinking of anybody specifically here, but I think sometimes the temptation for some might be to just not talk about it, or to just kind of let it go, because it's a little embarrassing as a teacher if you're wrong on something. It shouldn't be, because we are human, but at the same time we are teachers, so we if we're gonna have the role of teaching somebody else, we should be accurate in what we say. But I think there's some embarrassment, and then I think on like the more nefarious end, I think there could be a temptation for some where it's like, well, it might hurt book sales. And like I said, I'm not thinking of anybody specific there, and I don't know anybody that I don't know anybody in ministry that would think like that based on their character. But I could see that, as being a consideration if somebody was in ministry for the wrong reason. If they were in ministry to sell books, right? I could see that as a temptation to think of it that way. And I decided early on that I didn't want to be like that. Because before I was an author and before I got into full-time ministry myself, I followed a lot of authors, and I've read a lot of books, and I followed a lot of Christian teachers and stuff, and I knew at the time, if any one of them came out and said that they were wrong about something, it would not make me stop buying their books. It would not make me stop following them. And it would actually, for me, it would have built trust, because then it's like, okay, well, at least I know if he is wrong about something, he's going to tell me. Whereas this other person who's never admitted to being wrong, who knows? Because I imagine everybody, has been wrong on something before. So it's not about are they right or are they wrong? It's about are they willing to admit it? And so early on, I decided I want to be the guy that admits it when it happens. And because we don't expect that every book we buy is going to be 100% truth, because then we would be elevating it to the level of Scripture, and there's no book that can be elevated up to the level of Scripture like that. Now, we should be careful. We shouldn't be reckless in how we write. We need to really make sure that what we write is carefully thought out and carefully worded and researched, and that we're not writing things for the wrong reason, which I'm going to get into. Part of the reason that what I wrote was well, and I'll say it like this: what I wrote, and I'll explain it. What I wrote could be true. It's just there's no real reason to think it. And my reasoning for writing it, looking back on it, I don't think was an appropriate reason to put something in a book. So I decided that. I decided that early on. If I don't care if a book's been out for a couple of years, I don't care if it just came out. If there's something wrong in it, I want to be open about it, because I'm not in this to sell books. I'm in this to teach truth, and I'm in this to learn truth myself. So all of us can do that together as a family. So that's really important to me. In the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, I have an appendix. It's at the very end of the book. It's not, and it's funny that this part of the book I've never been asked about, really. I've never been asked to talk about it like in any interviews or anything. To me, it's not a particularly important part of the book. It was something that I already kind of had, and it was like, well, it has to do with like Earth and space and stuff, and it's kind of interesting. So maybe we can put this as an appendix in this book. And it's based in. If anything, it probably should have went in my book, Unraveling the Multiverse, because it's more quantum physics, like sciencey kind of stuff, and it doesn't really fit with The Day the Earth Stands Still. But I had all these pages. It was basically a whole chapter that I had written, and once the book was done, there wasn't a place for it, and I thought, man, I have this whole chapter. I don't want it to just go to waste. And instead of just holding on to it and putting it somewhere else, I added it as an appendix. Which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Lots of authors do that. Usually the appendix has something to do with the subject matter in the book and the way that, and I did have a tie into it. So let me tell you about what the appendix was. So I had written this chapter called like a planet called Heaven or extra dimensional Earth or something like that. But it was that the Earth is like heavier or more dense than it should be based on its side. Like it affects gravity more than it should based on its like weight, if you could call it weight. Weight isn't exactly the right word for it, but we can just use that for what we're talking about. But it's like based on everything we know about the Earth, it's too heavy for what it is. So the question is like, well, why is that? And the cool thing about like in quantum physics, our gravity in just our normal 3-dimensional space, if there is an extra dimension or if there are like extra dimensional objects, they would. And it's really cool because they've shown this mathematically even, like they would affect our gravity because the particle of gravity, gravitons, which, hasn't been observed, but it's a pretty sure thing that they exist. Every field has an associated particle. So, the electromagnetic field has photons, for example. So, so we have a gravity field. Stands to reason we have gravitons. Well, based on all the mathematical evidence of gravitons, they've been able to show that they can traverse dimensions. So if you remember that movie Interstellar, that movie was kind of based around this idea that extra dimensions can manipulate and affect gravity. So if there was, like, let's say if there was a planet that was in like the 4th dimension, so it was there, but we can't see it. We would be able to read its gravity and know something is there. So that made me wonder, well, if the Earth is heavier, could that mean that there's extra dimensional objects or extra dimensional things on the Earth that could be causing that extra weight, if we're going to call it weight? And if that was purely the reason, then fine. And because I think it's fine to speculate and wonder, and if I remember right, because it is a couple of years ago, I do believe that I did write throughout that whole chapter, and I hope I did, because this is usually how I write, that this is speculative. I don't know for sure. It could be, maybe, might be, a lot of that. So I didn't ever claim in there that this was absolutely the correct way to view like the model of the Earth, or this is how the Earth works. It's just more like it could. But here's the problem, though. Here's where I was wrong. At that time, I had lost like a lot of like good friends that I had for years. Good friends that basically just turned into different people, and it was at the time that the flat Earth movement thing was really at its height, and I'm not going to blame the flat Earth theory for this, because this is a human thing, and anybody could use any theory to act like this. But there were friends that I had that were using, the flat Earth model, that idea, to then get really prideful and like really angry with people online and get really mean and nasty. And Christians were fighting with Christians, and it was a big mess. And I had friends that I was close with, friends that I had like since I started ministry, friends that even helped me get into ministry. I mean, these were people that I like really looked up to. I had friends that just used that and totally became a different person. It wasn't a source of joy. It wasn't like, hey, I discovered this amazing thing about God's design and it's wonderful and I love you so much. And it wasn't that. It was just like bitter. It was anger towards me because I wasn't believing in it. Like I wasn't believing that the earth is flat, nor did I really care that much about it. So, I didn't think that I wasn't bothered by the fact that people believed in it. I was bothered by the fact that people were fighting about it. Like, really, that bothered me because I was losing good friends over it. And like I said, I don't want to blame just the idea that the earth is flat on that attitude. It's a human thing, because I also have a couple of friends that do believe the earth is flat that are just fine. Like, they're great. Like very, very, very loving towards me and Christina, and we're really close friends, and we just don't fight about that. We even talk about it, but we don't fight about it. And so I don't necessarily have, like, on that end of it, I don't really have a problem with people believing it. It's just, what are you doing with it? Are you saying the Bible teaches it? Are you using it as a means to, like, attack people and using it to, because I mean, I was having people tell me that I wasn't even saved. I was having people tell me that I don't love God and I don't really believe the Bible, and just really hateful things. And it was from a place of pride. It's like, if I thought someone thought they were Christian, but they really weren't, and that they were actually going to hell and they didn't realize it, that would really worry me. There's not an ounce of me that would feel like, oh, I really want to stick it to him. And there are prominent Christian leaders today that might be in that category. It worries me. I pray for them, and I don't want to, like, that scares me, because how easily could that have been any of us? And so I just, there's nothing in me that would be tempted towards that attitude. So it's hard for me to relate when somebody is doing that, because I didn't then want to fall into pride myself and get mad at them back and say, no, you're the one that doesn't believe the Bible because you think the earth is flat and the Bible doesn't teach that. And I didn't want to get into that, because then it's just, we would both be guilty of the same exact sin, even though we have different beliefs about a particular thing. It's not that thing that's the problem. It's the sin of pride and anger and hatred, really. So I didn't want to fall into that. Well, so I was coming off of this just long period of time where I was losing, like, close friends left and right. I couldn't seem to get through to anybody on this, like, hey, look, let's not fight about this. That we don't need to fight about it. We can, read the Bible, and there are some non-salvation things that we can come away with different interpretations, and it doesn't mean that we have to stop, like, that we have to hate each other. Like, we're never supposed to hate each other. We can debate these things. We can be open to other ways of thinking about it, but let's look at the Bible and see, what does the Bible actually teach, and use that as our central point of focus, and not, well, I believe this, you believe that, and we don't agree, and we hate each other, and you don't believe in the Bible. And so it really, really got to me. And then, so the extra dimensional Earth appendix thing in the book was sort of a reaction to that. It was sort of like, well, look, there are other ways to explain these passages, these so-called flat Earth passages, and I'd have to go back and read it because it's been a while. I don't know if I don't even think I mentioned flat Earth at all in that, but it was sort of a reaction to that, and that's why I said my motivation for writing that, including it in the book. Looking back on it now, I don't think that was a good motivation to include something like that. It wasn't like a mean, spiteful thing, but it was a reaction to this problem, and it was to me it was a way of saying, well, look, there are other ways that, if you want to take like a literal approach, there are other ways to view this, to take these passages. So basically what I was trying to say is, like, don't get hung up on one thing and be so prideful that you're going to hate all of your brothers and sisters who disagree with you. That was kind of what was in the back of my mind. But it was just a total reaction. Now, the science in there is true. The Earth is, weightier, or however you want to word it, by the measurements that, that I sourced in the book. It does appear to be that the Earth is weightier than it should be. And now that could be human error too. It very well could be. It could be that we just don't know how to properly measure that stuff out. But anyway, so it was a reaction to that, and it fell on deaf ears, as it probably should have. Not that it was necessarily wrong, but so in that appendix, I took these commonly used Bible verses for, to support flat Earth, and I said, well, it could be this, it could be extra dimensional. These could be, what if the Earth that we see isn't the only Earth? I mean, we know that there's like a physical temple, but there's a heavenly temple too. So what if there are other constructs? You can't really like locate heaven. You can't like point to a direction and say, okay, you go there, 1,000 miles, you'll reach heaven. Like it doesn't work that way. We know God is all around us. We kind of get the sense that heaven is sort of like that, but we don't really know. And so in a lot of my previous books, I said, it's probably like an extra dimensional thing, not to literalize everything, or not to take the majesty out of what heaven is, but if we're going to think about it in like terms that people from our age might kind of understand, it's sort of like an extra dimensional thing, possibly. It's like immaterial. It's beyond the physical realm, but it's still like here at the same time. And so in the appendix, I was saying, what if some of these constructs of heaven are actually affecting the gravity of Earth and causing it to, appear to be heavier than it should be? I still say it could be true, but that's not the best way to interpret some of the verses that I used. And I should have, if I wasn't reacting to something, while I might have kept that idea in the back of my head, and I might have even done a couple videos saying, hey, what if it's this? Wouldn't that be interesting? I don't think that I would have taken the time to write a whole chapter on it. And so let's say that, like, I didn't personally lose these friends that I was really close with and looked up to, and let's say that, like, Christians weren't fighting with each other about this topic. I don't think I would have taken the time to write that whole chapter, because it took a long time to write it. It's a long thing. And to explain how these extra dimensional constructs could all work, and you still have, you still have the model of the universe that most people accept, but you can still use all the. But I think the problem was I was making the same mistake that I believe that some people make when supporting flat Earth is I was taking verses, or because I wasn't all in on it, I wasn't saying this is how it was, but I was accepting the possibility of taking poetic verses more literal than they should. And I know a lot of times we hear that word poetic, and then sometimes we want to just shy away from that as like it makes it less true, or like, oh, well, anytime you don't want to believe something in the Bible, then you just say it's poetic, and then that's all you have to do. Then you don't have to think about it. And that is a straw man way to think. The people that when you talk to somebody who doesn't literalize the whole thing, but sees poetry in the Bible, because we can't get around it. There is poetry. There's entire books of poetry in the Bible. You can't get around it. They're not thinking that because they're stupid, or they're just not thinking, or they're not willing to accept that anything supernatural exists, or that's such a straw man. There's nothing real about that. There's nothing accurate about that. The reason that they're taking it poetically is because that's just that's the most sensical, appropriate way to take it, because it's poetic language, and it's just as simple as that. And we know that even Jesus used some of this language. Jesus used poetic language all the time. He called himself a door, or even a gate. So, using my possible extra dimensional perception, does that mean that when we go to heaven, when we see the earth from, let's say, a higher dimension, and that's probably not a good way to even describe it anyway, but let's just for sake of where we're at in the 21st century, and let's just say that let's use that. Do we think that we're going to look at Jesus and he's going to actually look like a door? Like when he's on earth, he looks like a man, but really his real image is a door or a gate, just to make those descriptions be literally true. Like, no one thinks that. That's totally unreasonable, because we know that he's speaking metaphorically or poetically. And sometimes metaphors, poetry, that kind of stuff, it can be the best way to explain a truth, like the parables. Do we, for us to believe the parables, would we have to say, at some point there really was a man planting a field, and some of the seeds went here, and some of the... No, that doesn't have to be like... Okay, if that didn't literally happen, if there wasn't some time where this actually happened that God is referring to, then it's not true. We're only thinking of literal truth. That's only one way to convey truth. And literal truth really only works with just the physical material world. But see, that's why we're so tempted by it, because we live in a physical, material, scientific age where we're inundated with that. We're only taught to think literally. So we're not really taught to think like poetically or metaphorically, but there are concepts and ideas that are absolutely real, but you wouldn't call them like literal in the sense that it's like a physical manifestation of something. So, I mean, we even get the word literal kind of mixed up on what that means. We tend to think literal means real, but that's not right. Literal is just basically just exactly what it says. How do you use it without putting the word in? Well, here, let's look up a dictionary definition of the word literal, and let's see how to define it. Definition, literal. All right, and it says, taking words in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or allegory, or of a translation representing the exact words of the original text. Okay, so if it's like a translation, a literal translation is you're representing the exact words. You're not embellishing on it. But the one that we're looking for here is taking words in their usual or most basic sense without allegory or metaphor. So like, and it gives the example dreadful, and here I can, dreadful, here, this is, so you can look at what I'm looking at, dreadful in its literal sense, full of dread, right? Dreadful, full of dread. So literal is just the most basic sense without metaphor or allegory. So it doesn't mean real, it doesn't mean true, it doesn't mean it's not that. It's just whatever you're talking about. Just it's basically reducing it down, taking the most basic sense of it and communicating that. All right, so there's a lot of literal truth in the Bible, but there's also a lot of poetic, metaphorical truth that can, I wouldn't say it's more true, but it's a different way to convey truth that can add more to what we're looking at. So I wanted to go through some of those verses that I used and show specifically on the pillars, because again, that chapter was really long and I've already been talking for half an hour. So I want to go through some of those verses quickly with you, because I want to talk about this Texas politician, and then I got to get ready for the day and head out to work. But I wanted to quickly go through some of these verses and show you that, I've come to the realization that there was no real reason for me to even bring in the like extra dimensional idea into it. Could it be true? It could be, but there's no reason to think really that it is, based on just the text itself, because the easiest way to understand it is that this is poetic language. So I'm going to show you some examples of, and we're only going to talk about pillars, but I'm going to show you some examples of literal instances where it talks about pillars, and then poetic ones, and even some that I used in that appendix. So and I want to like really emphasize too, it was just an appendix at the end of the book. It doesn't really have anything to do with the rest of the book. So yeah, let's get into it then. Because again, like I said, I think just the poetry angle, that's not something we should be afraid of or shy. And I think the reason that people are uncomfortable with it is because they don't know what literal means. And I'm not saying people are stupid, but there was a time I didn't know what it meant either. But I think it's just that about 5 seconds ago when I had to look up the definition. But I think it's we believe in the Bible, and we love the Bible, and we love Jesus, and we love God so much that we don't want to give anybody an excuse to not believe what it says for what it says. But we can't. We have to be really careful, and like I said, I'm guilty of this too, so I'm owning up to it, I'm admitting it, and I'm hoping other people who have done this, I'm hoping this will make you like if you've done this too, I hope it makes you comfortable realizing, it's okay, like it's actually better to admit that you made a mistake, because then you can learn and grow from it and make sure you don't make it again. Because what's most important to me is getting the text right and making sure that what we're looking at, that I'm representing the Bible correctly and I'm representing Jesus correctly. Are we ever going to have absolutely perfect theology or like a perfect interpretations of the Bible? Not on this side of heaven. It's just a given. There are going to be things that we have wrong ideas about. But it's, are we going to fully embrace that and then chase every wild, crazy theory that we can think of? We shouldn't do that. That's very irresponsible. And so I got to keep myself in check too, because sometimes you hear something and it's exciting and it's like, wow, is that true? So before we talk about it, we should, research it, but not with the conclusion in mind that we want this thing to be the truth. So we're going to go and reinterpret the Bible into that mindset. And because what I mean is, when I was using these verses, it was a reaction to the flat earth stuff. So I wasn't reading these verses and then coming away with the idea of extra dimensional earth. I already had that idea based on that discrepancy in the mathematics in the article that I read. And then I also had this flat earth thing happening. And then so I thought, well, hey, maybe these verses mean that. And like I said, I didn't say that it was like true or truth or anything. I did say throughout that this is very speculative and it's just a possibility. But still, there's no way. There's just no reason to think that. There really is no good reason, because when you read these verses, it's just obvious that it's poetic language, and we're gonna and that is what should be the focus. Like if I was going to write a chapter on these verses at all, it should have been, look at this beautiful poetry and let's look at what the truth that it's really communicating. Look how amazing and powerful God is. That should have been the focus if I was going to write a chapter at all. So I look at that appendix now and kind of think that was a missed opportunity, and so I want to improve on that. So let's talk about some of these verses. So let's look at a literal Example, Jeremiah 52:51. For a little bit of context, it's not, we're not doing a whole study into this, but it's talking about here, as for the two pillars, the one sea, the 12 bronze bowls that were under the sea, the stands which Solomon the king had made for the house of the Lord. All right, so this is something that Solomon the king had made for the temple, for the house of the Lord. As for the pillars, the height of one pillar was 18 cubits, its circumference was 12 cubits, and its thickness was 4 fingers, and it was hollow. All right, so this is literal. This one is absolutely literal because we have physical dimensions, measurements. There's no reason to think that this is poetic, right? So here's an example of something that's like obviously literal and no one would contend with. All right, and that's Jeremiah 52. Well, elsewhere in the book of Jeremiah, we have an example of the same word pillar being used in more of a metaphoric or poetic sense. So, you can read this. It's just right in the first chapter, but we'll back up a little bit. For behold, I am calling all the tribes of the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord, and they shall come, and everyone shall set his throne in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, against all its walls, and around and against the cities of Judah. And I will declare my judgments against them for all their evil in forsaking me. They have made offerings to other gods and worship the works of their own hands. But you, dress yourself for work, arise, and say to them everything I commanded you. Do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. And then here's our verse. And behold, I make you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar, and bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. Okay, so here's more metaphoric. This is just talking about like the strength, like the Lord saying, "This is what I'm going to do for you." It's like I'm going to make you like this, think of these things. That's how strong you're going to be. He's not literally saying, I'm going to transform you into a city. Like, you're people now, but I'm going to transform you into a city. And then that city is actually an iron pillar, literally, and bronze walls. It's both of those. And then that iron pillar and those bronze walls are going to go against the whole land, against the kings of Judah. So it's not going to be people doing that. It's going to be walls and this iron pillar that's also a city. See, that doesn't work literally. Does that mean that it's not true? Of course not. I mean, it is absolutely true, but it's metaphoric language. It's poetic language. Probably saying metaphoric is more accurate, but God is using an example of something, to put a picture in their mind, to show them what they're going to be like how they're going to be. So there's an example of. And by the way, I did not use that in the appendix. Not everything we're going to look at I put in that appendix. So I'm laying the case for, the poetry metaphorical thing. So there's a case where pillar is literal. There's a case where pillar is metaphorical, and that's in the same book. These are both in Jeremiah. So this was like a common thing that was done using, and we have words like that in English. You're going to be tough as nails. Does that mean that, if you tell somebody they're tough as nails, does that mean that their skin is literally no, of course not. And nobody reading that would think that, because you're using metaphorical language to show how to talk about somebody's like attitude. Let's look at another one. This is Genesis 26, and we know the story. Lot and his wife, they're fleeing from the city. Lot's wife is told not to look back. But she does, and then what happens? But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, this one somebody could say is metaphoric, but I think this is literal. I believe this is literal, because I don't see that. For one thing, that's the end of the story. When we look at the context, he overthrew those cities and the valley and all the inhabitants of the city and what grew on the ground. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar, and then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. By the way, there's a really cool reason why Lord is mentioned twice there. Too much to get into today, but that's like a really cool thing that it's sort of, well, it's too much to get into, but he overthrew the cities. Okay, so this is all an account of just what happened. I would put this whole passage in the literal camp. Now, could this pillar of salt be something poetic, meaning something else? I guess, but it doesn't explain it, and there's not really a reason to think that, because unless there was some idiom that I'm not aware of where pillar of salt, like in that day, meant something else, because that could be. There are places, definitely places in the Bible where you can't really tell if it's literal or metaphorical, and then sometimes it's because there was like a turn of phrase or an idiom or something that the people of that time used to explain something else. That can happen. I'm not aware of any with the pillar of salt thing, so I don't right now. I don't have a reason to think that this is anything but literal. So I think this is literal. I think she literally turned around and became a pillar of salt. But again, there are other ways. Like if there was some idiom or something and it meant something else, then it could be. But it's not explained. So I'm not aware of anything like that. Doesn't mean that it couldn't be true. But so that's literal, right? Let's. I think pretty much there's a pretty much consensus in Christianity that that's literal. Okay, well, let's look at a similar thing in Revelation. So she became a pillar of salt. She turned into a pillar of salt. She was a human, then she was like, I guess, a pillar of salt that looked like her, maybe, or who knows. But she was a human, then not, then pillar of salt. All right. Revelation 3:12, and this is talking to this is Jesus sending a letter to one of the churches, and he says, I'm coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. And then Revelation 3:12, the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Let's hope that's not literal, right? Because what would that mean? What would that be saying? Well, just as Lot's wife became a pillar of salt, like, okay, so our reward is that we're going to become a pillar, like we're going to be turned into a pillar, in this temple, like, so we're going to be a pillar of the temple. We're not allowed to leave. We can't go out of it. Like, we're just always a temple or a pillar holding up the ceiling, and God's going to inscribe things in us, and wouldn't that hurt? And no one takes that literally, but we know what he's saying. We understand what he's saying. He's like, you're going to be with me. You're actually going to have like a strong status where you're actually doing something that's important. You're gonna have an important status, and he's not literally going to like carve his name. He's saying, you're gonna be mine, and my name's gonna be on you, because when people look at you, they're gonna think of me. They're gonna know that you're with me. Like I would say, like, my name is on my kids. It's not really a phrase that we use, but what I mean is, like, they're my kids. Like, they know, oh, like you're Josh's son, or you're Josh's daughter. That it's more that. So we know that that's poetic and metaphorical. We know that, and thank God, because again, what a weird afterlife that would be, right? If it was just literal, and it just meant just exactly what it said in a literal sense, that we're going to have to hold up the temple ceiling, and that's our eternity, and we're not allowed to leave. So there are places where pillar is used where it's totally appropriate to take it as poetry, because to take it literally would be silly. And there are some people that will say, well, if you're going to take one thing as poetry, then you got to take all of it as poetry. No, because that's like reductive. The whole Bible it's not all literal. It's not all poetic. It's not all metaphoric. It's not all, just like it's not all the law. It's not all the prophets. It's not all the gospel. Now, of course, you can find elements of all of that stuff in the Bible. In a sense, like the whole Bible is the gospel, in that, like, you could even look at the law of Moses and see how it points towards Jesus. Yeah, of course. So, but that doesn't make any of it like less true. It's just the way that we classify ways of conveying the truth, right? So we have a literal way, we have a poetic way. There's just ways of conveying the truth. And but again, you could always have that Christian that says, well, Josh, the Bible is all gospel because all of it points to Jesus. I know, but when I know that, but we don't, when we give somebody a Bible, we don't say, here's a gospel for you. When we go to church, all right, open your gospels to Psalms 1. We don't. That's just not how we classify it. We classify the Gospels as the four books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we classify the law. We classify the prophets. So we have words for all of that. We have classifications. But it doesn't mean that any of those are less true. Just like a metaphoric truth isn't less true than a literal truth. It's just a different method to convey truth. All right, so let's look at some others. Now I have to remember the points that I was going to try to. I should keep notes, like the points I wanted to make with all these. But okay. So here's one where I think that pillars is being poetic. And so the reason that I wanted to look at those first ones was to show that there are uses of the word pillar in the Bible where it is obviously poetic. It's obviously metaphorical, And right now, I know there's a difference between the word metaphor and poetic, but just for right now, I'm just using those interchangeably for right now. Because in what we're going to look at, there are specific like poetry books, but it's using a metaphor. So I'm just using just to be clear, I'm just using those metaphorically right now. Or metaphor. I'm using those interchangeably right now. Excuse me. So I think that the easiest way to understand this passage or this verse, this use of the word pillar, is poetic. So it's Psalm 75. At the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity. When the earth totters and all its inhabitants, it is I who keep steady its pillars. Selah. So judging with equity, let's say if it's talking about like the day of the Lord, there's going to be a time where God comes and judges the world. And all throughout the Bible, you get this language of like the earth teetering to and fro. And a lot of times we want to think literally. Now, could that be part of it? Yeah, it could be. Like there could be earthquakes. I mean, we actually know there are earthquakes, but I don't think that's only what it's talking about, right? With the earth teetering to and fro. See, with something like that, a description like that, people that were reading this and us today, we're aware earthquakes exist. So when we think earth tottering, we might think earthquakes, but with this, the whole earth doing it, that seems to be something a little bit more chaotic. And so I think the main point here is it's conveying like not even the earth is going to be able to withstand this because God is so powerful, and you better get right with the Lord because you don't want him judging you like this because even the earth it can't. I think that's the idea. But it says, when the earth totters and all its inhabitants, it is I who keep steady its pillars. So what is it talking about with pillars there? Is this metaphoric or if we think of it literally, do we think that there are pillars like in the earth or under the earth and God's going to keep those steady somehow? Which, if it's literal, then those pillars are holding the earth up or they're like in the earth somehow. He's somehow going to keep those steady, but then the earth is going to, like, how does that work if the pillars are like fastened to it? Because there's other language in the Bible that says that like they're like fastened or something. So literally, you have to do a lot of. It doesn't make any kind of plain literal sense. Now, what does make sense is if it's poetic and it's just saying like, look, I the one who the earth can't withstand, my judgment. Like it is also I that can steady it. It is also I that keeps steady its pillars, like right now, or for the righteous. Because as we read on, he's making a distinction between the wicked and the righteous. And we actually get another metaphor because if you're going to take that pillars literally, you would have to take something else literally here too. And I say to the boastful, don't boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up your horn. Do not lift up your horn on high or speak with a haughty neck. Well, what horn? Is that like a horn coming out of their head? Is it like a trumpet? What horn are we talking about? Or maybe it's just a metaphor saying, like, don't be boastful. Don't lift your horn up high, you know. This could be one of those idioms, but we can read it and get a sense, because it's even down here. I will declare, and this is Psalm 75, 9 and 10. I will declare it forever. I will sing praises to the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked I will cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be lifted up. Okay, we don't have horns, right? Not literally. But that's not what it's saying. It's saying like okay, let's say. Okay, all the horns I will cut off. So think of like a rhinoceros or something. Like think of a big animal that has a horn coming out of it. Well, that's its main mode of like defense or aggression or something. That's what it uses as its like source of power, like how it can defend itself. You know, this horn. God's saying like, well, for the wicked, you know, whatever that is for them metaphorically, I'm going to cut that off. They're not going to have a defense. They're going to be weak, you know, in my presence. That's the idea. But the righteous, their horn shall be lifted up, you know, because the righteous aren't against God; they're with God. So that's our strength. So our horn isn't going to be cut off; it's going to be lifted up. So it's metaphorical because we don't all literally have horns. And the same is like if you want to say, well, though that's horn like trumpet. Okay, it's the same thing though. It's the same idea. So there's no reason to think that this literally means that pillars are in the earth. When you take the whole thing in context, it's poetic language, but it's also it's true. It's very true. Here's another one. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. So see, you know, the earth has 7 pillars in it. All right. There's a lot of metaphors going on here. The wisdom of God is being referred to as a woman, and even like a separate entity. We know that's not literally true because there's only one God, right? And this wisdom that's talked about here, it's metaphor. It's using the idea of a woman as a metaphor to explain what's going on. There's also something in the language about we don't really have this in English. Well, sometimes not really, but sometimes we do. Like when we talk about cities, we usually say like her. So like if we talk about like or countries like Israel, we'll say like her people. We don't mean literally that that Israel is a female. You know, it's just a way of referring to it. So there is that too. But when you read this, it's talking about wisdom itself. You know, the wisdom of God specifically, and it's referring to her as a woman. So there's a lot of metaphoric language going on here. Does that mean that it's a lie? Does that mean that it's not true? Well, if you say that the Bible is 100% literal, you would have to say that there's either some other woman God out there called wisdom, or that the Bible teaches. You would have to say that the Bible is lying. But no, it's because it's not all literally true. That doesn't mean that it's all not true. It just means there's other ways to convey truth. So this is a metaphor. So it would stand to reason the same would be true for the pillars. So we just have to keep in mind that it's perfectly fine and acceptable that some of this stuff is poetic. We don't have to be afraid of that. You know, it can actually help us, and as well as it should, because it's true. It helps us gain a clearer view of picture, a clearer picture of Scripture. Excuse me, a view of Scripture, picture, Scripture, view. It helps us look at the text more clearly. And when we compare it to how we talk today, I mean, this should be totally natural because we talk like this too. We don't only speak in literal truths all the time. We use metaphor and poetry to explain what we're talking about, especially if we're talking about like feelings or emotion or somebody's attributes. You know, the strength somebody has or something like that. So yeah, that shouldn't scare us or worry us. That shouldn't make us think that it's going to be harder for somebody to accept the Bible if they have to do that. God gave us the Bible that we have the way that it is for a reason. And so we just have to let the text say what it says. All right. So Here's another one. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him. But the thunder of his power who can understand? And, even up here, he has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters and the boundary between light and darkness. He covers the face of the full moon and spreads and spreads over it his cloud. I'm kind of reading backwards, but he binds up the water in his thick clouds, and the water doesn't split open. Okay, so all of this stuff, this is poetry to show how amazing God is. Otherwise, you have to say that literally the moon he covers the face of the full moon. Okay, so the full moon, and spreads over it his cloud. So you would have to say that, if I'm reading that literally, that like God has a cloud that's his, like that's separate from, because it's not clouds, it's his cloud that covers the face of only the full moon, not the other phases of the moon, but the full moon. It's just literally, how does that work? He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters, so like a perfect circle on the face of the waters, at the boundary between light and darkness. Okay, well, what's the boundary between light and darkness? We would, in a literal sense, then we would say, well, that's where like day becomes night, and that boundary of like where the sun's light shines and where it doesn't shine. All right, but that's constantly moving, right? So and also that boundary is really wide. That you, in a literal sense, you wouldn't call it a boundary, because it's not like at this exact inch there's light and this exact inch there's darkness. There's a bunch of gray area where it's kind of light and kind of dark. I mean, there's like hours of the day where it's like that. So it's like a gradient in a literal sense. And then what would okay, so the circle on the face of the waters at the boundary. So at this boundary between light and dark, just in the twilight, I guess, or in like midday or late afternoon, or wherever it's like not daytime anymore, but it's not quite night. So during those few hours of the darkness, but only on the face of the waters, though, is this circle thing. Now, I don't see why we would have to try to explain it in such a literal sense, when the easy thing to say is like God is just powerful. Like what message is it communicating here? Is it trying to get us to understand this thing about a literal circle, the literal boundary between light and dark, literally the face of, and it's only the waters too, it's not the land, because it says on the face of the waters. So some would say, well, that's the circle that, some try to say that it's the equator, some say it's like the circle that passes around the earth as night becomes day, but it says on the face of the water. So why not the land too? Why not on the face of the earth as a planet? Because that's not what it says. If we're taking it as just an absolutely literal thing, then this verse only applies to the face of the waters. He's inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. And he's not saying that the boundary between light and darkness is the circle. He's saying that is the location where he inscribed the circle. The location is on the face of the waters. Where's the face of the waters? It is at the boundary between light and darkness. What did he do there? He inscribed a circle. So just literally, even if you take any kind of model of the earth, even the spherical heliocentric model that I believe in, I wouldn't use this to say that that's what they're communicating. They're not communicating anything about the shape of the earth in this. It's who is in charge of creation, who is in charge of this light darkness of the day and the night, and all of creation, and who's the one that has done all this? Well, God. This is all poetic language to show just how powerful God is, and sometimes you can't describe that in a literal sense. How could you? Well, how would you describe God's power or strength in a literal sense? Well, he can lift 1,000,000 pounds. Okay, not 1,000,001. Like, there's no number that you could put on there. Like, to really speak appropriately and accurately about God's strength, you have to use metaphors. I mean, you can give examples of things that he's done, but every time you try to describe his strength literally, what you're really doing is you're reducing him down to that, and you're saying that okay, he's done this, he's as strong, he's so strong he can do this, but it's like it's almost like saying, but he's not stronger than that. He can't do, like, look how strong he is. Look what he did with Israel. Okay, so he can't do that with other countries. Like, it's almost like putting a limit on it. To speak of God's strength literally, you're putting a limit on it because you're saying he can do these things but no more. So you have to use. Because think about it, if you're talking about like how strong your dad is or something, sometimes when we're kids, we talk about like how when we were kids, we talk about like, well, my dad could beat up your dad. I saw him lift a car once. Okay, well, that's putting a limit on him, right? Obviously, the dad did not lift a car, but let's say that was true. Well, obviously, the kid is using the best example he can think of to show the strength of his dad. So he can lift a car. Well, that's limiting the dad to only being able to lift a car. Does that make sense? Because if he could lift a house, the kid would just say that. So it's the same thing here. If we could communicate God's strength literally, but we can't, because anything we say limits him to whatever example we would give. So we have to use metaphor. I mean, even in God created the earth. Oh, but not the universe? So, see, we're limiting him to just the earth if we're speaking only literally in that sense. And then, so that's why we say things, no, all of creation, heaven above and earth below, and, all of creation. And then we have to use these, I mean, even heaven above and earth below is metaphoric, because heaven isn't like a compass direction. Like, it's not a direction that you can travel to far enough and you would get there. So it's easier and more accurate to use metaphorical language in saying things like that. Now you could say like, okay, well, his strength is infinite. All right, fine, true, but we can't really get our heads around infinity. I mean, I can't get my head around, and neither can you, around a number that just doesn't end. That there's always the example of one more number. And it's because even infinity isn't literally true, it's a concept. Famous mathematician Carl Gauss even said that he like detested that infinity would ever be used in mathematics, because he said it's more of it's not a real number. It's not a real number. It's not a literal number. It could be real in the sense that it's real as a concept, but it's not like a literal number that you would ever be able to write down, because you could always add one. So even saying that God's strength is infinite is not a literal statement. It's a metaphorical one. Okay, so I don't want to get too hung up on that. Continuing on. No. Where are we at here? Another Job one. Okay, he who removes the mountains, this is Job 9:5 and continuing. He who removes the mountains and they know it not, when he overturns them in anger. Okay, mountains. Do we think these are literal mountains? Could they be symbols for something else? Could they possibly be nations or people? Maybe. Or could it be that it's just a metaphor that God's using? Can God literally remove mountains? Yes. But would you describe the mountains as they know not? They don't know it when he overturns them in his anger. Well, of course they don't know it. They don't have brains. Is that a literal statement that needs to be communicated? Nobody thinks that mountains has brains. It's because the point of the passage is not to teach like the biology of a mountain, which there is none. That's not the point. The point is, like, look at this big, amazing mountain, but God is so much stronger. He can overturn them in his anger, and the mountains don't even know it, because even though these mountains are huge and they're way bigger than us and they're strong, we can't take one of these things down. But even though they're all that, even the mountains are so below God, they don't even know. It's using the mountains as a big strong thing to compare to God, saying like God is so not only so much stronger than these things, but he has emotions and anger, and he knows everything, and these mountains don't even have any of that. They don't even know. So the idea is not to communicate that mountains don't have brains or consciousness. Everybody knows that. It's to say, we see this mountain as like a daunting thing. Like to climb a mountain is like a big achievement, right? But compared to God, they're nothing, because they don't even know when he overturns them in his anger. Like it's like a reminder of what a mountain really is, to put it in perspective compared against God. So but then what do we have after that? We get something else. Who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun and it does not rise, who seals up the stars, who alone stretches out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. So we have all of this language showing these things. There's no reason to think that this is like actual, like literal, like that's not the point. The point is, this is how amazing and powerful God is. Let's look at all of these things that, and use poetic language to show his strength. Look at all of these things, and he's more powerful than all that. So it goes on and on and on from there. Seems like I wanted to say something down here, or maybe I already did. But so we have more to look at. Okay, here's another one. I think this might be the last one. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. So this is the famous passage where Job is like questioning God, and God's letting him have it. So he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" The whole idea that God's going to get across here is like, I created everything. Know your place. You don't even know what you're talking about. That's the idea. All right. That's what he's going to communicate here. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? Okay, now that stretching the line upon it, a lot of people say that is also the equator, or maybe that's the boundary between light and darkness. But stretch the line, that's like a measurement device. Like when we would say tape, like we use tape measures now, but back then they would actually have like lines, like strings, like ropes that they would use to measure off things that they were building. God's using that language to communicate to Job, I made the earth. Like I created the earth. That's what God's telling Job here. Where were you when I measured when I measured the pieces do we literally think that he has a literal measuring line that he's used? Did he build the earth like that, the way we would build a house? No. We know he didn't, because he spoke it into existence, and the Bible describes that. So we know he didn't, like, he's not like a construction worker, like literally measuring out pieces of, because even then, even if we were going to think that, where'd the pieces come from, right? Where did the materials come from? He still had to make those. So that it's a measurement thing, and and that's also supported by the first part of the verse. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, or who stretched the line upon it. So who measured all this out? But do we literally think God made it that way? Like when you think of God like making a tree, do we think of him like putting up pieces of wood and nailing them and measuring the tree and making? No, he speaks things into existence, and then they reproduce, and so now they grow from seeds. But if you take that all the way back to the beginning, he spoke things into existence, and they just were. He didn't need materials to build anything out of. He didn't need measuring lines or hammers or nails. But what he's not communicating like what he's trying to tell Job. He's trying to put Job in his place. He's not communicating like the literal scientific, materialistic like truth of how he created the world or how the world is structured. That's not the point. He's using this language to tell Job, like, hey, when I created this stuff, and he's getting into like specifics. He's using metaphor, and part of it he's trying to kind of make him feel dumb, because he's putting him in his place. God loved Job, of course, but he's putting Job in his place and saying, "Oh, you're so smart. Well, where were you when I was nailing these boards and putting up these walls and building these pillars?" It's just language that he's using to make a point to Job, and the whole thing is like that. Yeah, I mean, it changed like it changed like clay under a seal. I mean, just right there we have like, and its features stood out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. And what is it talking about? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked shall be shaken out of it? So do we think that's literal? Like the skirts, the contours of the earth, and the wicked are literally shaken out of it, and they're flying off into space? It's metaphoric language, and that's the easiest way to understand it. Now, if somebody really wanted to, they could try to make the literal approach work. They could kind of cram it and force it in there, but you got to do a lot of stuff mentally that I don't think the Bible intends us to do. And the reason that I wanted to do that video is because in that appendix in that book, I was offering another way to do exactly that. To do these kind of mental things to make this work. That like the pillars are literally true, but it's in heaven, and once we're in heaven, we'll actually really see how the earth is constructed, and there's all this other stuff. There's just no, maybe, but there's, and like I said, I did say that in the appendix. This is speculation. Maybe this could be, I don't know. I did say all that, but there really wasn't any reason for me to even write it. And that's why I wanted to do this video and say that I was wrong, because the only reason I was writing it was not because I read these verses and then I came to that conclusion through the verses. It was because of everything that I said in the beginning of the video. So I don't think my reasons for it were all that great. So when you actually read the verses in context, and there's a lot of verses like this, when you read them in context, just the best way to understand them, the easiest way, the most intentional, what I think the Bible intended us to take it as. These verses, if they're poetry, that you take them as poetry. There was one other one that talked, and there was one more that I wanted to talk about, and I thought that I brought it up. Give me a second. There's. Where is it? There was one more where it talks about the waves, and it talks about that like God has put like doors and gates in the waters that like make sure like the waves don't come up too far on land, and that not everything is overtaken. And I'm having a hard time finding it now. I thought I brought it up, but maybe I didn't. I'm like going through all these verses now, but well, I apologize. There's a somebody else will probably be able to find it, but and I think it's in Job, but there's a verse in Job that talks about. I thought it was here in 38. Maybe I might just be missing it because I'm trying to do a show while I'm finding this. I should have highlighted it so I knew where I was going with all this. Oh, wait, is this it? Yeah. Okay. Here it is. Yeah. All right. It was actually just right after I was right after the point where I stopped. But all right. So he's saying, were you here when I did this? Or who did all this? Who created all this? Who determined its measurements? Okay. Then it says, or who shut in the sea with doors? when it burst out from the womb. So you'd have to have literal doors and literal womb. When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. So you'd have to take those literally too. And prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. So he's talking about waves here. And he's referring to them as proud, as if they have, if we're taking this literally, they have consciousness and they're proud. But he's talking about waves. And he's talking about like how far they come on land and recede, and like they're allowed to come this far on land, but no more. And it says because of these bars and doors. So do we literally think that like all around the land in our countries, and so in this case it would have been in Israel or wherever Job was at the time, somewhere in the Middle East. Do we think that the waters like literally had literal bars and doors that kept the waves from coming too far inland and killing everybody? No, of course not. Of course not. The point is, God is the one that's in control of that stuff. He's the one that gets to say if the waves are going to come up, how far they're going to come up on shore, if they're going to destroy everybody or not. Like, he's the one that makes that decision. He's using the language of bars and doors as metaphor so Job can kind of understand what he's talking about here. But God's not suggesting that he literally put doors and bars in the water to keep the waves from like artificial like doors and bars. It doesn't work. And you would have to take all of this literally if you want to say this language is literal. Who laid the cornerstone, the line, the foundation of the earth. If you want to say that's literal, you would have to be consistent and say that these are literal too. That there are bars and doors on the coasts that keep the water. And no, of course, we all understand that that's poetic and metaphoric. We all understand that. But that if you're going to say that that these descriptions are literal, you would have to be consistent and take those too, because it's described in the same way. It's in the same passage. God's using the same manner of speaking and language. So you would have to say that as well to be consistent. Whereas I say, well, no, it's the descriptions are poetic to speak to a higher truth that, or a more full truth, I guess, that God is in control of all of this. He's the one that is controlling this whole thing. That's how powerful and strong and in control and amazing that he is. It's not talking about the methods that he does things. It's just that he's the one doing them. And he's saying to Job, like, and who are you to question me? That's the point. And I know some people think that, well, if we teach it like that, people are going to read it and they're going to think that it's literal and they're going to be deceived. And, they're going to be mistaken. They're going to think the Bible teaches. Well, quit worrying about how other people are going to take it. How was it intended to be read? That's the whole point. How was it intended to be read? And looking at things, and of course, am I saying the whole Bible is poetic? No, and that's reductive and a straw man, because sometimes that will get said about people who say that parts of the Bible are poetic. Well, then you just don't know what to believe. No, you believe the poetry too. You believe it all. It's all true. All of the Bible is true. There are just different ways to convey truth, and there's nothing wrong with that, because we do that every day of our lives. We do that all the time, and we don't have any problem, knowing when somebody's speaking literally or metaphorically. It's just it's not really an issue. Now, sometimes can it be difficult? Sometimes can it be vague? Sometimes, but typically, if we're not like overthinking it or obsessing to the point that we're trying to find something in it that's not there, like if we're not doing that, then it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, do I think it's a salvation issue? No, but I mean, I guess it would depend on how far you take it, because there are some people that would, take the literal thing so far and say, well, there are very, very few people who would do this, but say, well, some of the things that Jesus said weren't literally true, so I'm not buying any of it. Okay, well, then they're being silly because there's lots of things that aren't literally true that they believe in just fine. I love you to the moon and back. Well, it's not literally true, so I don't believe you. They wouldn't say that, so that's silly. There are some that would try to make too much of it poetic, where there are literal truths, and they would try to say, well, and this happens a lot in prophecy. So, well, for this to work in my prophetic paradigm, this has to be allegory for something else where it's just like literal truth. So some people will do that with like the second coming of Christ, and they'll say that it's not literally true. It really means that, we're bringing the kingdom on earth. And some people take, so the poetry thing can be taken too far. You shouldn't look at the Bible as all poetic or all literal. You should, the parts that are poetic, the parts that are literal are literal. So that was the point that I wanted to make. That's what I wanted to talk about. And of course, I could talk about this I've already gone an hour and a half, so it's already way too long. But, and this was just the pillars, but I could talk more about it. Because there are other things like that in the Bible. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know and maybe I'll do more. But the other takeaway from this is Christians that believe in flat earth, they're our brothers and sisters, and this is not an issue that I think we need to divide on. Now, if they're using it as a way of saying, if you don't agree with me, you don't believe in the Bible, that is something to divide on, because that's something that can damage the church. That's putting a burden on Christians that God never intended. That's like Pharisaical at the point, adding to the scripture and putting that on people. That's not good. That is something to divide over. But then it's not really the whole flat earth idea that's doing it. It's the person's pride, or it's not the idea. Because like I said, I got a few friends that believe in flat earth, and we fellowship great together, and we talk about our differences. I have partial preterist friends, and I'm a futurist, but I have partial preterist friends that we fellowship great together because we know that most importantly is Jesus. What we agree on is Jesus. All this other stuff can make for interesting conversation, and it's interesting. And it's good, but we can have differences in beliefs and still be Christians, right? So where it starts to get sketchy is like, okay, is the Bible teaching this? Is this what the Bible intends you to believe? That's where it's like, man, I can only really speak for myself. If there was anything in that appendix where I might have suggested that, then like I want to repent of that immediately. Now, like I said, I did write. This is speculative, but still, I don't ever want to give the impression that that we should read those verses and this is what we should take away from. It was a reaction to an attitude in the church that I was seeing and I didn't like, and I wanted to say, hey, look, you guys don't have it all put together either. There are other ways to look at this, and your way isn't perfect. And but like I said, had I thought about it the way that I'm understanding it now, I probably would have never even wrote that chapter, or I would have wrote it very differently. But I probably wouldn't have spent any time on it. So, and it doesn't mean that, like I said, we could die and go to heaven and like see how heaven is constructed and how it like pairs with the earth, and that there could be all sorts of wonders with that, and I'm sure there are. But I don't think these verses are meant to teach us about those wonders. I think what these verses are meant to teach us is, the power, the majesty of God, that He's in control of all of this. And when we submit to God, that is who we're submitting to. I think that is the most important thing that we can take away, and that we should. All the other stuff we can speculate and discuss, but it should never be on the forefront. It should be like way down here on our list of priorities when it comes to this stuff. It shouldn't take priority over like what I see is like clearly intended what the clear intention is that the Bible's trying to communicate here. So yeah, that is okay. That's how I was wrong on the pillars of the earth. Okay, we got to talk about this Texas politician. I'm going to do that for members only. So if you haven't had a chance to already, go become a member at dailyrenegade.com. You'll get the rest of this Peck Report and the rest of all the shows that we do. We've got a lot of shows, and I'll tell you, if you were on the fence about getting a membership, please get one now. That would be great. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year. Now is the time to get it. Get the $100 a year if you can, because you get 2 months for free that way. You only got to pay for it once. You don't have to think about it again. So it's a great deal. Make sure you do that. I'm also going to have, like I mentioned before, a lot of information about Silent Cry coming up. So keep your eyes on that. All right, we're going to talk more to the members only. So go get a membership. That would be great. Help support our ministry if you believe in what we do. Also, check out the store. We have a bunch of new shirts. We have like hashtag Save the Children shirts now for Daily Renegade. It's just dailyrenegadestore.com. Go check that out. There's a bunch of new designs that I think that you guys will really like. And all of this stuff helps fund what we do, like fighting child sex trafficking and, all of that stuff. So it really does help. DailyRenegade.com is the place to go. Okay, we are going to call it good for everybody watching for free. Thank you so much. Members, hang on the line. Everybody else, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, take care and God bless.